Unmute. What do I have to say that hasn't already been said? As I thought of this word, I remembered an experience I'd had a few years ago. But it was significant because it hadn't only happened to me that one time, and I assume that's why it popped into my head. I was sitting in a restaurant, and there was a man sitting beside me. He was in a wheelchair, and it wasn't hard to notice how his arm was curling up. He wasn't sitting straight, and he talked quite slowly, and occasionally he needed some help when it came to cutting his food. Nevertheless, it was the most interesting thing to me. I never felt as though I was above him in any way. I just observed. The man sitting in the wheelchair looked to his side, and a warm smile spread across his face. His functioning hand waved accordingly. I looked over, and I saw that he was looking at a young girl. And despite his friendly gesture, she was staring at the man confused. The young girl asked her father what was wrong with the man, and he said, "Don't worry, he's not normal." The father pulled her closer to protect her from the man, and it was one of the most hated experiences of my life. That's because what those people in the restaurant didn't know was that the man sitting in the wheelchair used to be a professor at the local university. He had a bachelor's in economics, a master's in agricultural economics, a master's in business administration, and a PhD in marketing. He was also able to read by the age of 3, and that's just a little fun fact I liked about him. Be as it may, upon the remarkable stress that came from finishing his PhD, he unfortunately suffered a stroke in 2004. He was in a coma for months and had another stroke in 2010. The man sitting in the wheelchair's name was Zoltan, and it was through his experiences where I've gained my inspiration for this talk today. Now, unfortunately, discrimination and fear of handicapped people isn't a new thing. The only difference is, while we talk about feminism, LGBTQ+, and other widely discussed subjects, handicapped people have remained widely unacknowledged. It is simply reality, and it is why I'm discussing it now. Therefore, I'd like to go back to 1923, because I think it's a really good example of our history. At this time, the MITCHENER Centre was built in my province, Alberta, Canada, as a training school for mental defectives. It was part of the Alberta government's eugenics program, specifically designed to sterilize 2,844 people. The Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928 was made to prevent the genetic transmission of undesirable traits and protect individuals against the burden of parenting a disabled child. However, the means by which this was done was what has given the now closed centre its appalling reputation. Starting with bare, concrete walls and heavy locked doors with only a tiny opening for food deliveries, it is fair to say that the centre paralleled a prison. The rooms contained one-way mirrors so that residents could be watched and monitored, and patients were lucky if they had a window. For me, the most humiliating part was also the fact that they were stripped naked out of fear that they might hurt themselves. Lastly, due to the lack of facilities, it was common for residents to relieve themselves in their own cells, where a mere drain would lie installed in the ground. When it was time for bed, the same floor would be used to hold up a mattress, and this would be where individuals would sometimes be restrained with straitjackets as they slept. Now, as articles suggest, the timeout rooms allowed staff to handle residents with derogatory and senseless conduct, ultimately depriving them of their human rights and dignity. Of course, I truly believe that today, this would be considered to be far from acceptable. At the same time, I still think that our population's knowledge has a long way to go, because we still have the assumption that being handicapped is a bad thing. However, surveys actually reveal that people with disabilities consistently report a quality of life as good as, or sometimes even better than that of non-disabled people. And I think it's important to notice how much we actually have to learn from them. While I could talk about many disorders, one of the most fascinating ones for me has always been autism. By now, given that its prevalence has risen exponentially just in the past 30 years, it is likely that most people have had an encounter with someone who has had autism at some point in their life. But when I think of autism, I think of people who just have a small glitch in their brain. And sometimes I find that this glitch has the ability to make them even smarter than us. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder that affects communication and behavior. Although autism can be diagnosed at any age, it is said to be a developmental disorder because symptoms generally appear within the first 2 years of life. Common attributes of people with autism include altered communication skills, focused interests, practice behaviors, and sometimes they need some guidance when it comes to skills used in everyday life. Now, you can see how the NIMH phrases the symptoms slightly differently. I just think my definition sounds a little happier. In any case, autism is considered to be composed of a spectrum for a very important reason. It's different for everyone. I think it's obvious that people like to point out the negatives of each disorder, but I think, at least in the case of autism, it's important for us to look at the strengths. One of my favorite things about people with autism, for example, is the ability to learn things in incredible detail and for long periods of time. They also have really strong visual and auditory skills, and that's why they tend to lean towards subjects like math, science, music, or art. Thankfully, the NIMH includes this in their outline as well. But a really good example of how autism can actually be beneficial is by watching the movie Rain Man, which was released in 1988. Starring Dustin Hoffman as Raymond and Tom Cruise as Charlie, the movie centered around a selfish brother trying to trick his way into his father's inheritance. But to me, the message was much more than just about someone trying to snatch a few dollars. And I want to show you why I think that. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of a pile of toothpicks, which actually came from a scene in the movie. All I want you to do is count them, and I'll give you 10 seconds to do so. Now, obviously this is not a simple task, at least for the average brain. But for Raymond, who had autism, he was able to deduce the number as 246 in exactly the same time. I could also ask you what 312 times 123 is, which Raymond answered instantly with 38,376. Whether this is a movie or not, this is the potential of autism. And while these skills may not always be the case, to me it remains undoubtedly amazing. I myself am very interested in neuroscience, so one scientific explanation for this could be the potential of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to adapt to changes in an individual's environment by forming new neural connections over time. In other words, if a person suddenly became blind, their brain would adapt by improving one's hearing and sense of touch, and I've been to numerous lectures that have discussed this reoccurring pattern. Connecting this to someone who is handicapped, I think this is finally where we can start to see the potential. While neuroplasticity may seem like a simple explanation, it certainly leads to many pathways in which we can start to explore. Just because someone can't speak or move properly, it does not mean that they cannot do other things just as well or even better than someone who can. In fact, it seems that the brain actually likes to enhance the qualities that are remaining. I believe that the biggest issue with being human is that we're always in a battle between what we feel is right and what we're taught. The brain has an incredible capacity to learn things so quickly, and it's important to realize how this can affect us on a daily basis. It's hard to change habits and thoughts, but it's not impossible, and I would really encourage you to challenge them. Now I'd like to go back to Zoltan, the man sitting in the wheelchair, which, if you haven't guessed by now, is actually my dad. Speaking at an event called Unmute, there are a lot of things I could talk about, but nothing or nobody has ever had the same effect on my life as him. To this day, he was the smartest, funniest, and wisest person I have ever met, and I think the world would be a much more beautiful place with this realization. But what does this mean? Does this mean that you have to go outside right now and volunteer at the local rehabilitation center? No. But it means that something needs to change. It means that you need to understand that handicapped, disabled, they're words. And my dad was a physical representation that those words can have a lot of power. Yes, some of us have a glitch, but maybe that glitch could figure out the composition of dark matter, the true cause of the Great Depression, or maybe even understand why we dream. That maybe has potential, and that should excite us, not scare. Just because someone is different, it doesn't mean that we should invalidate who they are as people. On October 29th, 2020, my dad died due to complications due to stroke. But handicapped or not, if there was anything that my dad wanted those people in the restaurant to know, it was that he was a person too. Thank you.